Hello, and thank you for joining us in the Continuing the Conversation studio. Continuing the Conversation, or CTC, is an arts and education network founded and organized by alumni from the Arts and Education program at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. Our goal is to provide spaces for conversations that are important to advancing work in the arts and education sector, and to get as many people as we can across sectors engaged in those conversations. So you can join the conversation today by commenting on our website, aieconversation.org, or by tweeting with the hashtag AIECTCchat. I'm Eliza Greenberg, the co-chair of the CTC and an alumni of the AIE program, and I'm excited to welcome our guests to discuss reframing marginality. How do we understand the place of the arts in education? We're joined in the studio by Radhika Rao, a 2009 alumna of the doctoral program at the Harvard Graduate School of Education and a former teaching fellow for the Arts and Education program. Radhika is now a theater artist and a teaching artist and a storyteller and a writer in the Bay Area. And we are also joined by two students from the Arts and Education program, Maya Gomez, who is also a graduate student teacher at the Harvard Art Museums, and Jack Nicholas, who was a teaching artist in the San Francisco Bay Area. They are both currently students in the program. And as always, we're joined by Steve Seidel, who is the director of the Arts and Education program at Harvard. So Steve, I will hand it off to you to get the conversation started.
Thank you, Eliza, for getting us going and for convening us. It's always a pleasure to see you. And Radhika, it's great to see you after quite a while. So good. This is I would say that for me personally, the conversation about marginality and the ways that we think about the position of the arts in education has been, in a sense, very, very actively on my mind, probably since the 1980s when I was teaching a teaching artist for almost 8 years at South Boston High School in the Boston Public School System. So I'm just going to say a word about that time and why I think I started at that point feeling very involved with this question of marginality, and then bring it up to the framing for today's conversation. When I worked at South Boston High School, we were constantly being told that the program was going to be cut, and we had truly had a real battle to wage, I guess, to keep ourselves going. And it's a battle that is familiar to, I would say, almost every single teaching artist in America, and many administrators of nonprofits and arts partners, etc. The thing that was, there were a couple of things about that situation that were kind of problematic. And the one that I want to mention right now is that because we always had that was a battle that we had with central office. But I took that battle, in a sense, and internalized it and brought it into the school with me every day, and felt kind of convinced myself that nobody wanted us to be there, that nobody valued what we were doing, that nobody thought it was important for the students, and that was really wrong. There were people who were certainly indifferent to what we were doing in this theater program, but there were a lot of people who understood that there were any number of students who were coming to our classes every day and for whom this was an incredibly important part of their day, and may in fact have been why they were coming to school with any regularity. And there were people who were absolutely interested in connecting and collaborating. But at a certain point, I had so thoroughly internalized the marginalization that I think now, in retrospect, I was missing a tremendous number of opportunities, and that didn't serve me, and it certainly didn't serve my students. And I think it wasn't accurate, wasn't real. So I think it's an issue that we all, as individuals, but also as a sector, need to really look at. We see ourselves as marginal. It's absolutely true that we're not the same as mathematics. But is this marginality as real and powerful and all-pervasive as we often think it is, or could it be more a question of perception and internalization? Can the arts' role in education be in the margins, yet also be very driving and very powerful role to play, as artists in society often are? And if we take a broader view of the arts sector in education, not just the place of art in schools, does the picture change at all? If we expand out the lens, if you will, do we begin to see the picture of the role of the arts in young people's lives, in adults' lives, in communities, etc., as perhaps more powerful and vital than what we tend to feel, or at least what I came to internalize? So those are the kinds of questions, and I wonder if, we called it Reframing Marginality, and the invitation to Radhika and Maya and Jack today is really to rethink this language and this perception, this image, and to share whatever ideas you have about how we might move forward into a new image. So Radhika, would it be okay to reach across the country to you in San Francisco and ask you to share some of the thinking that you're doing? It'd be great for us, Radhika, if you would just give us a little bit of a very quick sense of sort of the view, the angle you're coming from, the work you're doing now, so that you have a sense of what your everyday is like.
Right. This is so rich. The angle I'm coming from, I feel like my story has always been to figure out where I stand in the world and where I belong in the world. And the more I've thought about that question, the more I feel like I've gone to the margins, and I was, raised in India, and, a good student, great grades, and had this crisis where I realized I didn't want to do what I was good at, and what I may want to do, which is to be an artist and teacher, I sucked at the moment, but I really wanted to work hard at it, and it was this weird thing. So life has always been very inconvenient for me in that sense, and I think that I've bemoaned that for a while, and then I end up going to Harvard, which is definitely not on the margins, but realize that I'm actually in the margins of Harvard. And then, you go to the education school and you're in the margins of the education school, and you keep getting pushed into margins, and then you get out of Harvard and you no longer have access to EBSCO-host and all these amazing research materials, and you're the margins there. And I decide I'm not going to be an academic and use whatever little privilege I could of my EDD, and instead be on the margins as like an adjunct and do work on, as a teaching artist, which is not a teacher either. So I feel like I'm just a margin in myself. But what has happened the last 2 years for me is that I have just discovered that for me there is no other way than to be on the margin, and that because I feel I'm so that I cannot not think about change and a social change, that inevitably those of us who do that have to be on the margins. So some of the things that are that I think I just want to quickly mention about margins, and they really draw on on what you're saying, Steve, is one is the marginality of the arts sector, and absolutely we're on the margins. We're there, we're on the margins. However, my question is, like, really, can we that there's parts of the arts, there are parts of arts experiences that are not on the margins, and they are some on the margins. And I think maybe Jack was speaking to that, so I'd let him speak to that later. But I've been thinking a lot about what kind of art is on the margin and what kind of art is being funded. And from my own perspective as a theater artist, I very much feel that I must start to create from the margins, but my intention is not to stay on the margins and to be a starving artist, but to be empowered in that and then, you know, draw my funding from there. As far as the marginality of the artist is concerned, I have thought a lot about this, right, from the demographics of who comes into MFA, BFA programs, or you know, EDM programs in arts education. I think that overwhelmingly the population that comes in are not marginalized, at least socioeconomically, and so we're fairly privileged as a community. And the provocative question I want to throw out is, do we feel more marginalized? Are we more like, what is the word for prickly about being on the margins? As opposed to somebody who might be more used to the margins. So, you know, I'm from Harvard, so does it prick me more that I'm, you know, a teaching artist that doesn't make much money? I'm like, heck, I have an EDD from Harvard, you know? And so I've been thinking a lot about marginality of teaching artists and the privilege of being able to be an artist in this economy, and asking ourselves some real questions. And the reason why I think about that is because I'm contrasting myself with the population that I am teaching that are marginalized socioeconomically, and that they're on the margins of society and not able to, like, gain benefit from the privilege of arts education. So I very much feel privileged, you know, to teach them. So I'm just, that's a heck of a lot of stuff, but you know, I'm going to leave it at that, and very, very interested in your students.
Yeah, Radhika, I totally. Well, first of all, thank you for giving us a sense of your situation, where you're coming from. I think that's really, really helpful, and I'd like to encourage Jack and Maya to just also, as you speak, to, you know, to give us locate yourselves a little bit. But I think, Radhika, I think you're raising a very, very powerful set of questions about what I was calling before the perception of marginality, and particularly, what does that mean when that perception is happening for someone who in many ways is coming from a privileged position in this society. And so there's lots in what you're raising, but I won't go further down that path immediately. We'll see what kinds of connections we draw, but let's open it up. And Jack and Maya, who'd like to go next?
Sure, yeah.
Okay, so let's turn to Jack. And,
yeah, sorry everyone for the amazing black backlight from behind me. It's the grace of God shining behind me. So I'm a theater teaching artist. I've worked in New York and in the San Francisco Bay Area. I'm more of the East Bay Radhika, so Berkeley and Oakland. We can fight about that later. And where I sit, I think there's so many interesting things that happened, Radhika, in what you said, so I'm really just swimming in a bunch of notes. But I think a lot about, and I've got the freedom to be positive because I'm sitting here at Hugsy and I've got access to all the resources, and it's just everything is great here. I think I try to look for spaces in which there's strength to work from, right? Because I think we've all experienced the spiritual drain that comes from constantly remembering, oh, we're on the margins, oh, we don't make any money, oh, we don't get any funding. Just, you know, that's a long road to hoe. So I look for the places of strength. And just some things, Radhika, as you were talking, you really made me think about, you know, what are the strengths of being on the places where the edge is. And I was thinking nothing really fun happens in the middle, right? When you're in the middle, when you're in the mainstream, you see a lot of boring, same, familiar things, and maybe there's a way to look at our space on the margins as being the place of questioning, of trying to find new creative solutions. I think working in the arts, and really many fields of inquiry, but I can speak from my perspective as a theater artist, that the restrictions are what give us the creativity. And I know that when I teach, it's that's really where I try to take my students, is to see the restrictions as gifts to work around. And so from an idealized, happy, we're going to make it all out okay, I look for how can we look at our space marginalized as artists in the culture and as arts educators at Hugsy, and all the different ways that maybe as high artists that feel like we're working in a place where the popular arts are being pushed with all the funding, or if we're working in popular media and we feel like the high artists are elitists and pushing us out because we're not respected, right? There's always a restriction there, and there's always something to try to work around, and I find that to be an interesting question to always be able to sit with, right? How can I turn this into something that I'm going to work with? And then that made me think about how, as the art space, we're always, I think through history, we've sat on the margins in some way or another, right? The artists have always been separate from society, looking in, the mirror held up to society. And I think about how in the education world, then as marginal spaces, we can be home spaces. And Steve, this I think came up in your the Moises Kaufman piece, the Beyond, I forget what it was called, Beyond the Drama Club, or something to that effect, about the ways in which the art space can be a home space for counter narratives, for counter thought, things that aren't necessarily as encouraged in the mainstream standards-based education space. And I think that's what I'm sitting with right now, is how can we relieve the burden of being on the margins and embrace that as the opportunity. And I think that's very easy to say and very hard to do. So we'll see how that bears out in the next decade to 2 decades.
Okay. Thank you, Jack. Let's turn over here to Maya.
That was a lot to digest. But I'm coming from California, and I was fortunate enough to be a part of an after-school program on the margins of my dance education. And so I spent 8 years dancing outside of school, so it was outside of my core academic curriculum. But when I think of education, I think of it as, what it means to grow and be human. And so I think it's always at the core. I think the arts are at the core of what it means to grow and learn. But I think it's getting stuck into that narrow academic framework of what it means to teach and learn in the arts. And so after my after-school marginality of learning dance, I actually became a dance major at UC Santa Barbara. And that was a big shift in terms of it was the core of my academic world, and it meant that I was being assessed and graded. And so I think it's an important thing to consider when we're looking at arts in education, if we're willing to move it into the space in which we're actually measuring it at the same rate that mathematics or these core subjects are being measured. So I guess that's a little bit about my background in terms of what it means for me to be on the margins. I have had the privilege of being able to be with parents who support my interest in the arts and what it means to be human, so majoring in dance was not an issue. And I do really resonate with your sentiments, Radhika, in terms of who I know who are artists as adults and professionals. They do come from a privileged background. And I think really heavily about the work that I get to do with students when they're in high school. We just saw a group from City Arts. They're all in high school and they're loving their artistic expression. And I consider, what are they going to do beyond this? Are they going to major in it in college? Are they going to be able to go to art school? And how can we sort of create a core within our own network of arts educators or artists, where art is at the core, to help support what it means, I guess, for other people to gain entry into it. So those are my thoughts.
Great. So, Radhika, I want to come back to you and see whether how you hear what Jack and Maya have been talking about, and whether it triggers or you have questions, etc.
Well, here's what it triggers. I feel like I want to be back in AIE again. I'm just so inspired by both of them, and just just their hope, enthusiasm, and tremendous sharp intellect. So I wanted to say that first. What it sparks for me is this idea of pride, and I think what Jack said was it really resonated with me, the spiritual drain of being an arts educator, or of being an artist, or a teaching artist, and the spiritual drain, I've felt it profoundly. You know, and this feeling that you're doing something that isn't, you know, a real job, or that isn't useful, and and on the flip side is this idea, and it brings me back to something that there was, I think, in NPR or KQED, which is our public channel station here in the Bay Area, where Arthur Mitchell from Dance Theater Harlem was talking about, there was a teaching artist that called in, and she was saying, oh, we're on the margins and we're on the fringes and nobody respects us anymore. And, you know, you think Arthur Mitchell was going to say yes, yes, yes to that. And he says, what do you expect? You know, he says, what do you expect? Like, we are, and he said, artists are earthworms. They go to a place that is barren, and they shake it up and they make it fertile, and then and then everybody moves in there, right? It becomes, the real estate rises, everything happens, and then the artists are pushed out. Then they go somewhere else, and they're you know, and so this idea of there's only, I think, pride and a high self-concept or esteem that can really battle that spiritual drain. And I think that you know, Maya really again, I think she really brought that home for me. And so I'm left with this thought, because I've been thinking about the privilege that I have being an artist over the last 5 years of my life that have been intense after leaving Harvard and leaving the protection of Harvard. And I think about the privilege of that, that what do the arts do? And the arts, what do the arts do? And one of the things that they do, and the gift that they've given me, is a way to process the world, and the process to rise from the margins and to empower ourselves and find a frame where we can spiritually rejuvenate, emotionally take care of ourselves, because they're expressive. Whatever the art form is expressive. And I see my, you know, I see the students that I teach that don't have a channel. I'm especially at the moment engaged in boys education and thinking a lot about boys not having places to express themselves. And I think that that is something that that we need to pass on and move back. And so even if I'm on the margins economically, I feel that I'm extremely empowered and privileged emotionally and spiritually, as long as I can recognize that and have pride in that. So it's like a little switch that went off for me, you know, a while ago, that has helped me deal with this. And the more that switch has gone off, the more money and resources and everything is presenting themselves to me. So yeah, so that's what's alive for me right now.
Radhika, that was fantastic, and yet we actually lost a little bit of the last part that you were saying. I'm not sure if you should try to go back, or if maybe I could just say that. You know, part of what I think we're actually exploring today is a reframing of marginality in relation to ideas of privilege, and it's not. It's striking me as not especially traditional notions of privilege. If traditional notions of privilege, insofar as traditional notions of privilege might have to do with something like job security, or you know, being able to do things like buy a house and a car, and you know, because we know that lots of people who are putting their who feel the privilege of working, as you know, I often say the incredible blessing in my life that I work at the intersection of art and learning. Which to me is an amazing space to be in. But you know, I mean, I would be very honest that I say that now from the position of having a full-time job, and one that has been secure, knock on wood, job that has been secure now for quite a few years. But when I was at South Boston High School, I was teaching adjunct. I was teaching part-time at South Boston, adjunct at Roxbury Community College. I had 2 young children. We didn't. We had no income basically because the kids had to be somewhere when Adrian and I were working. I mean, that was not. I mean, I think I was very privileged in that in many ways, but didn't have that much backup, and it was a difficult time. So I want to honor the realities of the if you will, the financial marginalization of so many of the positions in this field. And we've made comments about the privileges of the time you have at Harvard, but let's also be real. You carry debt when you leave here, and for many people that debt is enormous and is with them for a very long time. So that reality is real. But I think that we're taking some really interesting steps around this reframing, and I just want to. I'm noticing the time. I think it would be great to hear. Let's go back to Maya, if that's okay.
Sure.
And then back to Jack, and then Radhika, give you the last word, and then we'll be wrapping up. Does that seem okay?
I'm struck by your notion of the socioeconomic space that we exist in as artists and as people who want to teach. I think just even being educators, I think of just our society as a whole and how we can potentially reframe our economic framework so that we're subsidizing the people that care for our children and care for our humanity the most with respect. And I think of a unit of, I guess, redwood trees, and I think of the strength that the redwoods really pull from one another. And so I'm eager to continue the conversation with networks like this and utilize the strengths that we have within the community so that we're not simply looking at ourselves as silos within this field, but strengthening one another and ensuring that we all get paid and fed so that we can nourish ourselves to nourish others.
Lovely. And Jack?
Yeah. On this issue of the economic marginalization and the food and bed realities of the world, I think about a book I'm reading right now that I heartily recommend to everybody called Educating for Insurgency. That's written by Jay Gillen, I think is his name, and he comes from Bob Moses's Algebra Project. And he frames the work of being an educator with students of poverty as an insurgency, right? And an insurgency in the way of living for a time that does not yet exist, but when the conditions are right, that he will be ready. And the educators that are working for a more human, less metrics dependent, however you want to frame a counter narrative of education in today's context, that they'll be ready, and that there's a network of people that are taking care of each other, I think spiritually and financially and whatever resources people need. And so as I think about the work to do as I come out of this privileged space carrying a fair share of economic burden, is the work of carving out a space where the things we're talking about here, the really beautiful things we're talking about here, can be kept alive, and hope that there are other people out there that believe in it and find each other and hold each other's hands as we fight the oppressive forces that want to keep us hungry.
Okay, Radhika, you get the last word.
That is incredible, and I just want to say that I just love the way Maya uses metaphor. She's done that this whole session, and whether it was her aunt's story that I think was in the pre-session that we had, or the redwoods, and I think that is the beauty of just being an artist, that we're able to speak in metaphors, and that then reaches our audience in a way that they're ready to get. So I just want to really acknowledge that as an example of how we get our message across. So I want to build on what Jack said with educating for insurgency, and this idea that I'm right now I'm very struck by Paul Kuttner's article on cultural citizenship that I believe just came out in Curriculum Inquiry in a journal that is also being edited by Hugsy alums, and my own work is based on that, this idea of the artist being a cultural citizen, and I've been thinking a lot about citizenship for the last few years, about a citizen being somebody who questions, somebody who thinks about social justice, somebody who is ask the higher powers to be accountable for something, and this idea of how difficult it is to be that kind of citizen that protests and that leads revolutions without burning out, and how my own, and I've never felt compelled to take to the streets myself. I have joined street protests, but for me, I feel like my art is revolution, and this idea that this idea of educating for insurgency, this idea of being a citizen, and seeing ourselves as citizens, and as artists, and calling for that kind of attention proudly is something that's staying with me. And I'd like to end by just saying that I very much feel, especially because I'm an immigrant, and that I'm compelled by this idea of global citizenry, especially in the context of two things that we need to solve globally, which is global violence and the environmental crisis. Like, we can't afford to think about borders anymore, and so it almost seems like I feel a calling for artists to emerge from the margins and really like step in, because I think that there's a way in which we can do this without making people defensive, and do it in a way that really calls us to, calls people to like unite. So yeah, those are some of the things that I'm thinking about moving forward, and I'm hoping to do some of that work myself through theater. Yeah.
Radhika, beautiful, and I appreciate your thoughts there at the end, and it's good to hear what about the role of the artist, the role of the educator as a citizen. I mean, I think sometimes it's really helpful to I don't know, pull the lens back a little bit. So, if you look too much at your one situation, it can be a very narrow view. But if you expand your sense of your identity, as you're describing right now, and saying it's not just an artist, not just an educator, it's not just an arts educator, it's an artist, educator, citizen. It opens up the space and allows us to think in different ways, and I think we've really kind of done that in this conversation today. Part of the way that I think about, and if dare to use the word measure, the success of one of these studio chats is in how many surprising places the conversation goes. I think that there are, just in quickly reflecting on this conversation, which I think opened up lots of reframings of marginality. There are also puzzles, for everyone that we've named, there are attendant puzzles to them. And I think that we sort of surfaced a bunch of those puzzles. I think it's the work moving forward to try to keep untangling the knots that attend to this language, but this language which is not just a language, but expresses things fundamental and very powerful about the ways in which we see ourselves, we invite others to see us, we are seen by others, and that's always the work. So, Radhika, lovely, lovely, lovely to hear your voice and to see you. And Jack and Maya, thank you so much. And Eliza, I hand it back to you.
Thank you, and thank you all for joining us, and I hope that everyone will continue this work with us and continue to untangle these ideas with us online. So be sure to head over to aieconversation.org to add your thoughts and your comments so that we can continue this conversation. And please do spread the word about this conversation and our future conversations. We'll be back in the studio on March 27th to discuss research and policy, and we look forward to seeing you then. Thank you.